Georgia Republicans are pushing forward with an expansive new bill aimed at restricting voter rights. Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock addressed the proposed law in his first speech on the Senate floor this week.
We are witnessing right now a massive and unabashed assault on voting rights, unlike anything we've ever seen since the Jim Crow era. This is democracy in reverse. Rather than voters being able to pick the politicians are trying to cherry pick their voters.
Democracy in reverse. But Georgia is not alone. At least 250 new laws aimed at limiting voter rights have been proposed across the country. According to an article by the Washington Post, these GOP-backed measures could create hurdles for tens of millions of voters. Kate Rabinowitz, staff writer for the Washington Post and one of the authors of that article, is here to discuss her reporting. Kate, thanks so much for joining us. So, Georgia House Republicans are currently trying to pass this massive new bill that restricts voters' rights, including giving the state board powers over local election officials and limiting weekend early voting. The committee could vote on this legislation as early as Monday. Explain to our viewers why this is so critical. Explain to our viewers why Senator Warnock is so passionate about it in the first speech that he chose to deliver on the floor of the Senate.
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me. And as you said in your opening, what's happening in Georgia is something that's happening across the country in 42 other states where Republicans are introducing bills that would restrict voting, really every aspect of it, from voting by mail to early voting to voting on election day. What we're seeing in Georgia is a bit fluid at the moment. They are putting together a bill that combines a House and Senate bill that they introduced a 93-page version of on Wednesday. They introduced a updated version of that on Thursday. It looks like what they're going to vote on Monday will actually not include the most restrictive measures, which would be requiring a person to have an excuse to vote by mail as opposed to anyone being able to vote by mail, and limiting Sunday early voting, which can be hugely restrictive, particularly to the Black community who often participates in Souls to Polls events. So it looks like the bill on Monday will not include those two most restrictive measures, but are including many other restrictions, such as requiring a voter ID to request an absentee ballot and having a ID to vote by mail. As I said, this is a bit fluid. The Georgia legislator hasn't yet fully released the text of the bill, so voting rights groups and Democrats are very anxious to see what that actually looks like.
You sort of touched on the question that I was going to ask you next, is that, a lot of these restrictions that are being proposed are focused on early voting and mail-in voting. And I don't know if it's partially because they think these will be easier to reverse because there were a lot of changes to deal with the challenges that the pandemic posed. And so maybe they think, oh, we can just go back to what it was before and a little bit more. I don't know. But you kind of touched on the significance of focusing on these two areas, early voting and mail-in voting, and who it impacts the most.
Right. So last election, 2020, the general, saw a massive increase in turnout, the highest turnout in over a century, and nearly 3/4 of the electorate voted either early or by mail. Nearly all of the changes that made these methods more accessible were temporary. So these ended either at the end of 2020 or will end before 2022. Republicans see an opportunity to make these methods even more restrictive than they were before. And so a lot of what this would do is push voting exclusively onto Election Day. And experts say that this is likely to have a disparate impact in cities and particularly within Black communities, which often face longer lines on Election Day to begin with.
It is so remarkable to me that the United States does not have a national holiday when it comes to voting. A lot of other countries do. Mexico, the United Kingdom. We have Columbus Day as a national federal holiday, but not the day when we exercise our right to vote, which is sort of remarkable to me, has always been sort of remarkable to me. The question, Kate, that I have, though, about this is, does this have anything to do with former President Trump, who's suggested that he could potentially run in 2024? I'm trying to understand why it seems that it's Republicans that are seeking to make it harder for people to vote.
Absolutely. So a couple points here. One is that by and large in 2020, people that voted early and people that voted by mail were more likely to vote for President Biden than Trump. This hasn't always been the case. Absentee voting, voting by mail, was not so partisan, but it was the calls by Trump in the leading up to the last election, saying that it was fraudulent, that really turned many Republicans off to that method of voting, according to our sources. So this is a way of cutting back on the method of voting that, at least in the last election, was more beneficial to Democrats. A lot of what we're hearing from Republicans in terms of justifications for these restrictions is that they are necessary to shore up confidence in our voting system. What we've heard from experts is actually that a great way to shore up confidence is for them to say that they're confident in the system. There has been no evidence of widespread fraud in the previous election. So it is kind of a problem that Trump and those like him and his party have created themselves. We've also heard that it's important in some respects to introduce these restrictions as a way to show loyalty to Trump, these Republican state lawmakers, so that they don't face challenges from within their own party in 2022.
Yeah, I guess, we're talking about a lot of states where the elections ran really smoothly. The former president did not contest the outcome. We have, Republicans that dominate the state Senate, and so it seems like Republicans are winning in those states. So it sort of begs the question, why would you do this? Clearly, Republican voters are finding ways to make it to the polls. Why change it?
That's right. We're seeing, as I mentioned at the top, restrictions being proposed in 43 states. This includes states that Trump handily won. For instance, Iowa has passed a bill limiting early voting. No one is contesting that Trump won Iowa. What we're seeing is part of this is rhetoric to show that you're loyal to Trump, according to sources that we've spoken with. But it is also kind of regardless of where these take place, methods that are likely to have a disparate impact in cities and communities of color, which are both voting blocs that often swing Democrat.
So, Kate, many of the most restrictive proposals are in states, as Anne-Marie pointed out, where Republicans control both the state legislative chambers and the governorships, such as Arizona, Georgia, South Carolina, Missouri, Florida. So what's the prospect in those particular states?
Right. So currently there are 23 states that have so-called Republican trifectas, where they control both the legislature and the governorship. These states are more likely to see passage than, for instance, a bill in Washington state, which proposes an end to vote by mail. It doesn't mean that they will pass. It's an increased likelihood. I think it's important to note that with in all of these states, if passage does occur and it's signed by the governor, these will almost certainly face legal challenges. Voting rights groups are very much ready for a long legal battle, and it will be incumbent on states to prove why these restrictions are necessary.
And so there's no concern that, if you restrict one segment of the population, you're restricting others. So you can't just restrict Democratic voters. You're going to restrict Republican supporters as well.
That's That's absolutely right. And it's interesting to see the change in Republican kind of policy over time. For instance, right now in Florida, there's a bill to end so-called automatic mail voting, where you can say, yes, I want to vote by mail in every election going forward. This is something that in the past was championed by Republicans because a significant portion of their base would use that to vote. So these bills are not going to solely hurt Democrats. Of course, there are Republicans who'd like to vote earlier and like to vote by mail as well.
All right, Kate Rabinowitz, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.